Anne Merritt did not scream. She did not weep. She did not let go. Her hand found the ribbon at her throat, the one that held Edmund's signet ring against her collarbone, and closed around it the way a woman closes a fist around the one thing left to close a fist around. Behind her, 3 small bodies had fused themselves to her skirts, as if by agreement made without words. Henry, 8, had both arms locked at her waist, and his chin set the way his father's used to set, right before Edmund said something no one could talk him out of. Susan, 6, had gone silent in the particular way of a child who has decided that silence is a kind of armour. And Jack, 4, simply screamed into the wool of Anne's skirt, muffled, furious, refusing to be pried. Refusing to be reasoned with, refusing. A footman in Ashford livery reached for Henry's wrist. Anne looked at his hand until he took it back. "You will not touch my son," she said. She did not raise her voice to say it. She did not need to. Behind the footman stood the Duke of Ashford, tall in the doorway of her own gate, a man who had ridden 11 miles to stand in a lane in October and inform a widow that her children were no longer, strictly speaking, hers to keep. He had not expected this. She could see that much in the stillness that had come over his face, not cruelty, she would understand much later, but a man discovering that duty has a sound, and the sound is a 4-year-old screaming into wool. By the time the sun set that day, the county would be talking of nothing else. By spring they would be talking of something else again, and it would not be pity. But that was still 11 miles and 5 months away, and for now there was only the gate and the cold, and 3 children who had made a decision no one had asked them to make, and would not be unmade from it. The October before had been ordinary. That was the strange, useless thing Anne would think of later, that the year leading up to the worst day of her life had contained nothing to warn her of it. The barley had come in fair. The roof of Larkspur Cottage had held through one more winter with only 2 new patches. She had taught Henry his letters and Susan her numbers, and had begun, that autumn, to let Jack hold the pen himself, guiding his fat small fist through the loops of his own name. She had been a Whitfield before she was a Merritt, a corn factor's daughter from the county town, raised over a counting house, taught arithmetic before she was taught embroidery. Because her father believed a woman who could not read a ledger was a woman waiting to be cheated. She had married Edmund Merritt, second son to the old Duke of Ashford, in the summer of 1811, in Fenwick's small stone church, with the blacksmith and the housekeeper standing witness, because neither family had troubled to send anyone grander. The old Duke had not forgiven the match. He had not needed to say so aloud, he had simply stopped writing, and a man's silence, sustained for years, says itself. Edmund had not minded, or had said he did not, which was not quite the same thing. He had taken his captain's commission and his small income and his coal merchant's daughter-wife to Larkspur Cottage. 11 miles from the Hall he would never again be welcome in. And there they had built something narrow and entire. 3 children, a garden that fed them, a ledger Anne kept in a hand steadier than most clerks, and evenings by a fire that did not care whose son he had been. He had gone to Belgium in the spring of 1815, and had not come back from it. The letter informing her had been 4 lines long, and had used the word regret twice. She had read it standing in the kitchen, and had allowed herself 4 minutes by the mantel clock. She had counted them since, always 4, never 5. And then she had gone and told Mrs. Pruitt they would need to let out the hem of Henry's morning coat, because he was growing, war or no war, and a boy could not go about with his wrists showing. That was the shape her grief had taken from the first day. A drawer she opened for exactly as long as she allowed, and then closed. The county had called it coldness at first. Later it would call it something else. She did not much care what it was called, so long as the children were fed, and the roof held, and the ledger balanced, which, through 2 years of care so careful it left her hands raw with ink and small labour, it did. The old Duke had died that same winter, and Julian Merritt, the elder brother, had come into the title he had spent his whole life being trained for, and none of his life wanting. He was 34, unmarried, and, the county said, when it said anything of him at all, a man who wrote excellent letters and visited nowhere. He had sent, twice a year, a sum for the children's keep, delivered by a solicitor's clerk who never stayed for tea. He had never come himself. Anne had stopped expecting him to. She had not known, in October of 1817, that a cousin named Silas Merritt had begun, some months before, to visit Ashford Hall with unusual frequency, nor that he had begun asking a great many careful questions about a small stone church in Fenwick, and a wedding recorded there 6 years before, and whether the copy of that record lodged with the bishop's registry matched, in every particular, the one bound into the parish's own book. She would learn all of that later, in pieces, the way one learns the shape of a wound only after it has already been dealt. What she knew, on the morning the carriage came up the lane with the ducal crest on its door, was only this, that the Duke of Ashford had never once set foot at Larkspur Cottage in 6 years, and that he had chosen, for his first visit, a Tuesday in October, with no letter of warning at all. He came down from the carriage alone at first, though 4 men followed, 2 footmen, a groom, and a narrow gentleman in grey, who did not get down but watched from the window with the stillness of a man counting something. Julian Merritt was not what Anne had built him into, in 6 years of not meeting him. He was not cruel-faced. He looked, if anything, like a man walking toward a duty he had rehearsed and still dreaded, the particular stiffness of someone arriving to do a thing he has decided is right and is no longer certain of at all. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "I am sorry to come without notice." "You are the Duke of Ashford," Anne said. "You need no notice to come to Ashford land. This cottage sits on it." Something crossed his face at that. She would think of it later as the first true thing he said without meaning to. "Yes," he said, "it does." He told her plainly, because he was not, whatever else he was, a man who dressed things up. He had come, he said, to take the children into his own household. Henry was heir presumptive to a dukedom, and had spent 8 years learning nothing of what that would require of him. Susan and Jack would want for masters, for society, for a name spoken properly in rooms that mattered. He had brought a settlement for her, a fair one, he said, generous, she would want for nothing, and a solicitor's letter setting out the terms. She would of course be permitted to visit. "They are Merritts," he said, when she did not answer. "They belong at Ashford." "A mother's love is not a qualification, Mrs. Merritt." It was then that Henry, who had been listening at the door with the particular fury of an 8-year-old, who understands everything and can prevent nothing, came out into the yard at a dead run, and Susan after him, and Jack behind them both, and the footman reached for Henry's wrist because it was the nearest one, and Anne said the 4 words that would be repeated in 3 counties before spring, "You will not touch," and did not raise her voice. The Duke looked, for a long moment, at 3 children fused to a woman he had come prepared to think of as an obstacle, and something in his face went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes and cannot make, come out differently. "A fortnight," he said finally. "I will give you a fortnight to make your arrangements, Mrs. Merritt. I did not come to drag children from a gate like a bailiff seizing cattle." He paused. "I will need to see proof of the marriage lines in that time. There is some question of the record. I am told there is some question." "Told by whom?" Anne said. He did not answer that. He got back into the carriage, and the narrow grey gentleman at the window looked at her once, without expression, the way a man looks at a column of figures he expects to alter in his favour, and the carriage turned in the lane and was gone, and the dust of it settled, and Anne Merritt stood in her own yard with her children still attached to her skirts, and did not, even then, weep. She allowed herself 4 minutes. She counted them by the church clock, faintly audible across the fields. Then she peeled Jack's fingers gently from her skirt, one at a time, kissed the top of his head, and said, "Come inside. We have work to do." Mrs. Pruitt was waiting in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, a woman built along the same lines as the cottage itself, square, plain, load-bearing. She had been housekeeper to Anne's mother-in-law once, before the old Duke turned everyone out who had ever shown Edmund kindness, and had come to Larkspur for half wages the year Anne married, and had never once mentioned the difference. "Well, Mrs. Pruitt said. "That's a fortnight, then. That's a fortnight," Anne agreed. "What'll you do with it?" Anne looked at the drawer of the writing-desk where Edmund's papers were kept, and at the ribbon at her throat, and at her children, still breathing hard from the yard, watching her with the particular trust of the very young, who believe entirely that their mother is equal to whatever has just happened. "I am going to find every piece of paper in this county that says these children are mine to keep," she said, "and then I am going to make him read every one of them aloud." "That's my girl," said Mrs. Pruitt, which was as close as she ever came to sentiment, and went to put the kettle on. The fortnight did not begin with papers. It began with the roof. The east gable of Larkspur Cottage had been leaking since the February gales, a slow, persistent drip that had over 3 winters of patching become a small local legend among the tenant farmers, who supplied Anne's thatch and timber on credit she was slow but scrupulous to repay. She had been putting off the proper mending for a year, waiting for a season with coin to spare. Now, with a Duke's fortnight running out over her head, she went to Josiah Fenn's timber yard on the Wednesday and asked for the beams on the same terms as always, a quarter now, the rest at Michaelmas, fully expecting, for the first time in 3 winters, to be refused. "Heard the Duke came by your gate," Fenn said, not looking up from his ledger. "He did." "Heard your boy near took a man's hand off." "He did not," Anne said, "though I understand the impulse." Fenn looked at her then, a long assessing look, the look of a tradesman deciding whether a debt is good. "You've paid me on the day you said you would, every quarter, 6 years running," he said. "Man in my trade doesn't see that from gentry half so often as he sees it from you." He wrote the terms without further comment, and added, as she was leaving, "There's talk you might not be at Larkspur come spring." "There's talk of a great many things," Anne said. "I find most of it wants proof." She had the beams by Thursday, and the roof mended by the following Tuesday, and stood in the yard afterward with Henry beside her, both of them looking up at timber that would this time. "Hold, is that for us?" Henry asked, "or for him? So he can't say the roof leaks and we're not looked after." Anne considered her son, who at 8 had already learned to ask the second question, the one under the first one. "Both," she said. "A thing can be true and useful at the same time, Henry. That is not dishonesty. That is simply doing the work twice, with one motion. It was the kind of remark her own father had made over a ledger 100 times, and she heard it come out of her own mouth with something like surprise. A debt unpaid is a door left open, he used to say. Shut your doors, Anne. She had spent 6 years shutting them one at a time. She did not yet know how many more there were to close. The solicitor came on the Friday, sent, his letter said, to review certain of Captain Merritt's papers on his Grace's instruction, in advance of the fortnight's end. Anne had expected a narrow grey man like the one in the carriage window. She got instead a tall, unhurried gentleman of perhaps 35, ink-stained at the second finger, who introduced himself as Nathaniel Ross and asked, before anything else, whether he might see the household accounts as well as the marriage lines, since his Grace's office would want to know the children had been properly kept. "You may see whatever you like," Anne said. "I have nothing here I am ashamed of." She set the ledgers before him, 6 years of them, in her own careful hand, every shilling of Edmund's small income and every egg sold at the Fenwick market entered and balanced to the farthing. Ross read for the better part of an hour without speaking, which Anne came to understand over the following weeks was simply how the man was made. He did not fill silence for the comfort of filling it. "These are very well kept," he said at last. "I was raised to keep them well. Most gentlemen's stewards do not keep them half so well." He looked up at her, not unkindly, with the particular attention of a man revising an assumption in real time. "I confess I expected, forgive me, I expected disorder." His Grace's cousin described the household as struggling. "His Grace's cousin has never set foot in this household," Anne said. "Which cousin?" "Mr. Silas Merritt. He manages a good deal of the correspondence regarding the succession, in his Grace's confidence." Ross said it plainly, without weight, but something in Anne's stillness made him pause. "You know him?" "I have never met him," Anne said. "But I begin to think I ought to." Ross left with copies of 3 years' accounts and a promise to return before the fortnight's end. And Anne stood at the gate watching his gig go down the lane, and thought, not for the first time, that a man who read a ledger for an hour in silence, checking each column against itself, was a rarer thing in this county than a duke. The second week brought the second trial, and it came, as she had half expected it would, wearing a pleasant face. Silas Merritt arrived without warning on the Monday, driving himself in a smart curricle, a slight man with a smile that arrived before anything worth smiling about had been said. He introduced himself at the gate as a cousin of the family, come to see the children his Grace had spoken of, purely, he said, out of family feeling, since it seemed there might soon be a great change in their circumstances, and he wished to know them before it came. Anne did not let him pass the gate. "You may know them," she said, "once there is a change in their circumstances to know them for. Until then, I do not receive strangers who arrive to inspect my sons like horses at a fair." "I had heard you were plain-spoken," Silas said, still smiling. "I did not expect quite so much of it before I'd said good morning properly." "Good morning," Anne said. "You may go now." He did not go at once. He looked past her, at the cottage, at the mended roof, at Susan watching from the window with the frank, unblinking suspicion of a 6-year-old who has been told, correctly, that this man is not a friend. "It is a great deal of trouble," Silas said, keeping up an estate on a captain's pension and a widow's ingenuity. "I understand there are questions even about whether the marriage that produced all this trouble was ever quite properly done. Such a pity if it should prove otherwise. For the children's sake, I mean." "There is no question about my marriage," Anne said, "except the one's being manufactured by men with something to gain from the answer." Silas's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes recalibrated, the way a man's face changes when a shot has landed nearer the mark than he expected it to be permitted to land. "I am only the family's servant in this," he said. "I want only what is right for the boy." "Then you will be glad," Anne said, "to know that I want precisely the same thing, and have 6 years more practice wanting it than you do. Good day, Mr. Merritt." She shut the gate. She did not shut it hard. She did not need to. That night, after the children were down, she took out paper and began for the first time a list, not of accounts but of proofs, the church register at Fenwick, the diocesan copy, the witnesses who had stood up with her and Edmund 6 years before, the banns as they'd been read aloud on 3 Sundays in the spring of 1811, still, she was nearly certain, recorded in the vestry book. She wrote each item in her clearest hand, the hand her father had drilled into her over a counting-house desk, and beside each one she wrote where and who, until the page looked less like a widow's private grief, and more like what it was becoming, a case. Mrs. Pruitt, reading over her shoulder with the frank proprietorship of an old servant, said only, "That's the way of it, then," and went to bank the fire, and the house settled around them the particular way it had learned to settle since Edmund died, cold at the corners, holding its breath, waiting to find out whether it would be allowed to be a home much longer. Julian Merritt had not, in 6 years, told anyone the reason he never visited Larkspur Cottage, and he did not tell Anne now. On the grey November afternoon he came back alone, without footman, without Silas, and asked stiffly, as a man asks for something he has decided he has no right to, whether he might sit in her kitchen and speak with her plainly. She let him in because Mrs. Pruitt was watching from the scullery with an axe-handle expression that suggested she would be within call, and because 6 years of running an estate on nothing had taught Anne that useful information rarely arrives through a shut door. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Henry did his sums, and looked, for a long moment, at the room, the mended roof visible through the window, the neat stack of ledgers on the sideboard, a child's carved horse left on the window-sill. "My brother was happy here," he said. "It was not a question. He was. I did not think he would be. I told him he would regret it within a year." Julian's hands, Anne noticed, were folded very precisely on the table, the way a man folds his hands when he does not trust them otherwise. "I was wrong. I did not write to tell him so. I meant to. There is always, I find, a next letter one means to write." "And then there is no more time to write it," Anne said. Yes, he looked up at her, and for the first time since the gate, something in his face was not duty but plain grief, unrehearsed. "My father disowned him within the month of your marriage. I did not stop it. I could have. I was the heir. I had some standing to speak, and I said nothing, because it was easier to say nothing, and because I believed then that Edmund had thrown away everything that mattered for a match beneath him." He stopped, started again. "I have had 2 years to discover I was the one who threw away what mattered. He wrote to me twice, from Belgium. I did not answer the first letter before the second came, and I did not answer the second before the news came instead. I have not slept a full night since. I do not say that for your sympathy, Mrs. Merritt. I say it because I think you are owed the reason I have been a coward about this family for 6 years, before I ask anything further of you." Anne sat down across from him. She did not, at first, say anything at all. She had learned, from her father, that silence is sometimes the most honest answer available. "You came to my gate," she said finally, "to take my children because you believe you failed your brother, and you would rather fail correctly this time, by the letter of duty. than risk failing again by trusting your own judgment. Julian's jaw worked once. That is a great deal more precise than I would have put it. I keep precise accounts, Your Grace. It is a habit that extends to people. She folded her own hands, mirroring his without meaning to. I will tell you plainly what I require, since we are being plain. I require that you make no further decision about my children's future without informing me first, in writing, with time enough to answer. I require that whatever question your cousin has raised about my marriage be brought to me directly, in full, so that I may answer it with proof rather than rumour. And I require that you not mistake my composure for indifference. I have not raised 3 children alone on a captain's pension by feeling nothing. I have simply declined to spend what I feel where it does no one any good. Something in Julian's face eased, very slightly, not a smile, nothing so simple as that, but the particular loosening of a man who has been braced for a blow that did not, after all, land where he expected. "Show me," he said. "Not the ledgers. Ross has told me of the ledgers. Show me the children. Let me come to know them as they are, over time, and not as a problem I arrived here to solve in an afternoon." "That," Anne said, "I can allow." Slowly, on my ground. He reached, without quite meaning to, for something on the table, a small brass button, one of Edmund's, that Susan had been polishing that morning and left behind, and turned it over once in his fingers before setting it down with a care that surprised her. "That was his," Julian said. "The naval coat. Our mother had the buttons cast twice, once for each of us, when we took our commissions." He looked up, and his eyes went, for the first time, to the ribbon at Anne's throat, to the ring resting just above the collar of her dress. That was our mother's ring. She gave it to Edmund the week before the wedding, to give to his bride, because our father would not release the family jewels to a match he had not sanctioned. I did not know he had done it. His voice, when it came again, was not steady. I am glad he did. Anne's hand went, briefly, to the ring, the way it always did. For the first time in 2 years, the gesture did not feel entirely like grief. As to Silas's question, Julian said, gathering himself, duty reasserting its grip the way it always did, "I am told the diocesan copy of your marriage record shows some irregularity, a discrepancy in the witnessing. He has advised me it may not be sound in law." "Then I suggest," Anne said, "that before your Grace disturbs 3 children over a copy, he examine the original. The parish keeps its own book, Your Grace, quite separate from whatever travels to the bishop's registry. I was married in Fenwick Church. I suggest we ask Fenwick." It was the first time she had seen him look unmistakably like a man reconsidering not merely his decision, but the man who had counselled him into it. "I will ask Fenwick," he said. The document that undid Silas Merritt began, as such things generally do, with a man too careful by half. Nathaniel Ross found it on a wet Thursday in the vestry of Fenwick Church, with Reverend Aldous Coulter, 71 years old, half-deaf in one ear, and entirely certain of his own memory, turning the heavy bound register with hands that shook slightly from age and not at all from doubt. "Here," the old man said, tapping the page. "The 9th of June, 1811, Edmund Merritt, bachelor, of this parish, to Anne Whitfield, spinster, I married them myself, in this church. With the banns read 3 Sundays running, as the law requires, and Isaiah Dobbs and Margaret Pruitt stood witness, and there is their signatures, and there is mine." He looked up over his spectacles. "I have kept this register 40 years, Mr. Ross. No man has touched it but me." "And the copy sent to the bishop's registry?" Ross asked. Copied out fair each Michaelmas by whatever clerk the diocese sends round. This past year it was a young man named Fenn, no relation to your timberman, I believe, sent down from the registry office in the county town. The vicar's face clouded. Came twice, if I recall. Said the first copy wanted correcting for a blot. Ross had gone very still. The particular stillness of a man who has just watched a column of figures resolve into an answer he suspected, but had not yet proven. May I see the correspondence appointing him? It took 4 days, and one uncomfortable interview conducted by Ross and Anne together in the parlour of a modest lodging-house in the county town, to draw the truth out of Josiah Fenn, no relation to the timberman, as it happened, a thin, anxious young copying clerk, who had been 3 months in arrears on his own rent, when a Mr. Silas Merritt had called on him with £20, and a request that seemed, at the time, almost harmless. Recopy the Fenwick entry, with the witness names transposed to a page further back. Dated a fortnight earlier than the true wedding, so that it would appear the banns had not been properly completed before the ceremony, a defect small enough to cast doubt, large enough to void a marriage in a contested court, and nearly invisible to anyone who did not think to compare the diocesan copy against the parish's own book. He said no one would ever trouble to check the two against each other, Fenn said, twisting his hands. He said it was a family matter, nothing that concerned me. I have not slept since. I did not know there were children in it. He did not tell me there were children in it. Will you say so before witnesses? Anne asked, precisely what you have told us? Fenn looked at her for a long moment, a woman with steady eyes and a ribbon at her throat, asking him to undo, publicly, the worst thing he had ever done for £20, and something in him seemed to settle, the relief of a man finally permitted to put down a weight he had been carrying alone. I will, he said. God help me, I will. Silas did not go quietly into the trap closing around him. Within the week, a sworn statement arrived at Ashford Hall, procured, Anne would later learn, from an old servant of the previous dukes, a woman named Cobb, who had been pensioned off years before and was persuaded, with promises of a better pension, to swear she had heard the old duke say, before his death, that Edmund's marriage was no marriage in his eyes, nor in the laws if ever it were tested. It was not proof of anything but an old man's bitterness, but it was ugly, and it was time to reach Julian on the very morning he had meant to write to Anne, confirming Fenwick's register stood unaltered. Anne read the copy of it that Ross brought her. Ross had begun, by then, to bring her every paper as it came, without waiting to be asked, a habit she noticed and did not yet name, and set it down on the table with a steadiness that cost her more than it showed. He is throwing what he has left, she said. A dead man's temper, second hand, from a servant he is paying to remember it. That is not evidence, Miss Ross. That is noise made to sound like evidence. It has rattled his Grace, Ross said carefully. Then his Grace and I shall have to unrattle him together. She looked at Ross for a moment longer than the sentence required. Thank you for bringing it to me plainly. Most men in your position would have softened it first, to spare me. I did not think, Ross said, that you were a woman who wanted sparing. I think you would rather have the true weight of a thing than a comfortable underestimate of it. You think correctly, Anne said, and found, for the first time in longer than she could name, that she was very nearly smiling. Julian called the hearing for the 14th of December, at Ashford Hall itself, in the long gallery where 3 generations of Merritts had settled estate business before an audience of tenants and family. Because, he told Anne plainly, in the letter that gave a full week's notice, as he had promised he now always would. A claim raised in whispers ought to be answered in a room too full of witnesses for whispers to survive it. The gallery was crowded by noon, tenants from both the Ashford and Fenwick land, the blacksmith Isaiah Dobbs in his good coat, Mrs. Pruitt seated near the front, with her arms folded like a woman prepared to stand up and say something, regardless of whether she was asked. Reverend Coulter, with the parish register itself, wrapped in oilcloth under his arm, as though it might otherwise be snatched from him in the street. Sir Rowland Ashby, the county's magistrate, sat near the Duke's chair at Julian's own request, to see that whatever was said within the bounds of law. Silas Merritt stood near the centre of the room in a coat too well cut for a family servant, and smiled at Anne when she came in with the children beside her. Henry with his chin set, Susan very upright, Jack's hand fast in hers, the particular warmth of a man who has not yet understood that the room has already begun to turn against him. "Your Grace," Silas began, "when Julian called the matter open, I have brought this forward only from family loyalty, and with great reluctance, because I believe the succession must rest on certainty, not sentiment. I have here a sworn statement from Mrs. Cobb, long in service to your late father, attesting to his own doubts of the marriage's validity, and I have reason to believe the parish record itself may not withstand close examination." "Then let us examine it closely," Anne said, before Julian could answer. She had not been asked to speak first. She spoke first anyway, and no one in the room moved to stop her. "Reverend Coulter has brought the parish's own register, the true one, kept in his own hand these 40 years, never out of the church's keeping. I would ask that it be compared, here, before this room, against the copy Mr. Merritt has offered as evidence of irregularity." Coulter came forward and set the great book on the table, and read out, in a voice that carried to the back of the gallery despite his age, the entry for the 9th of June 1811, the banns, the date, the names, his own signature, and the 2 witnesses beside it. "And who," Anne said, turning to Silas with a stillness that made the room lean toward her, "prepared the diocesan copy that disagrees with it?" "A clerk of the registry office," Silas said. "I could not say which." "You could," said a voice from the back of the gallery, and Josiah Fenn came forward through the parting crowd, pale, his hands shaking, but his voice, when he found it, steady enough to carry. "It was me. Mr. Merritt paid me £20 to alter the copy. I have his own letter appointing the task, and I have brought it, because I would rather lose my place than let 3 children lose their name for what I did out of debt." The silence that followed had a texture to it, the particular silence of a room recalibrating in real time, dozens of small private certainties overturning at once. Silas's smile had not entirely left his face, but it had stopped meaning anything. It hung there the way a lamp burns on after the room has already filled with morning light. "This is a conspiracy of servants and tradesmen against a gentleman's word," Silas said, and even as he said it, Anne watched something go out behind his eyes. The particular flatness of a man who has heard himself say a losing sentence and cannot call it back. "You mentioned Mrs. Cobb heard my father-in-law speak his doubts in private," Anne said. "You did not say when. I have here," she drew a folded paper from her own reticule, unhurried, a letter from the same Mrs. Cobb, given to Reverend Coulter not 3 days ago, once she learned there were children in this matter, and not merely an old man's pride, in which she withdraws entirely what she was persuaded to swear, and states that it was you, Mr. Merritt, who first suggested to her the words she might use, and named the sum for using them. She had not raised her voice once. She did not raise it now. You built this claim on a forged copy and a bought memory, Mr. Merritt, against a marriage recorded in a church register that has never left its own vestry. I would ask you, before this room, to explain to me precisely what discrepancy remains. Silas did not answer. The room did the answering for him. A low, moving murmur, tenants glancing at one another, Mrs. Pruitt rising half out of her chair before thinking better of it, Sir Rowland Ashby writing something with unhurried finality in the ledger before him. Julian rose. "Mr. Merritt," he said, and his voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who had spent his whole life being trained to speak in this room, and had never before had cause to use it against family. "You are no longer welcome at Ashford, nor at any house that answers to my name. I will not bring the law's full weight upon you, though I would be within my rights to. That mercy is not mine to offer alone." He looked at Anne. It is hers, if she will grant it. The room turned to her, every face in it, tenant and gentry alike, waiting. Anne looked at Silas Merritt for a long moment, at the smile finally, entirely gone, at a man who had tried to take her children's name to buy himself one, and thought of her father's voice. "Shut your doors, Anne. You will leave the county," she said, "and you will not return to it, nor write to these children, nor trouble this family again in any particular, for as long as you live. In exchange, I will not see you prosecuted for what would cost you a great deal more than your comfort. I do this not for your sake, Miss Merritt, but because I find I would rather spend what is left of my anger on raising 3 children than on watching one more man be ruined by it. That is not weakness. Mark it well before you mistake it for such again." Silas Merritt left Ashford Hall that afternoon in a hired gig, alone, and was not seen in the county again. The room did not empty quickly. It took a long while, Anne would think later, for a room that has just watched its own certainties overturned to remember how to disperse, tenants lingering to shake Reverend Coulter's hand, Mrs. Pruitt accepting, with visible discomfort, the congratulations of women who had pitied her mistress 6 months before, and now could not get near enough to her. But it was Julian who came to Anne last, when the gallery had thinned, and asked whether she would sit with him a while, that there might at last be the explanation he owed her, in full, and not merely the apology that had come tumbling out of him, unrehearsed in her kitchen weeks before. "An apology and an explanation are not the same thing," Anne said, when they were seated, the children sent ahead with Mrs. Pruitt to see the stables. "I have had the apology. I find I want the explanation too. In full, if you are able to give it." He gave it. He told her of a father who measured his sons by what they married rather than what they were, of a brother who had chosen love over the ledger of family opinion and paid for it in silence, of his own long training in believing that duty correctly performed excused every private failure of nerve. He told her he had believed, walking up her lane in October, that he was doing the harder, better thing, safeguarding a name, a succession, a boy's future, and had discovered instead, watching 3 children refuse to be parted from their mother, that he did not know the first thing about what a family actually required to survive. "I know it now," he said. "I am slow to it. I do not ask you to think me swift." "I do not," Anne said. "I ask other things instead." She set them out as plainly as she had set out her ledgers, that her guardianship of the children would not be a courtesy extended at his pleasure, but a settled fact, in writing, unassailable by any future cousin or claim, that Henry would be educated for the dukedom, but at Larkspur first and Ashford after, on a course she and Julian agreed together, not one imposed, that Susan and Jack would want for nothing, but would be raised, always, knowing exactly whose children they were, and exactly how hard their mother had worked to keep them so, that the tenants of both Ashford and Fenwick, who had extended her credit and kept her counsel through 6 lean years, be paid. From that day forward, a fair wage and fair terms, as proof, not spoken, simply done, that the house had learned something. "All right," Julian said, when she had finished. "All right, then," Anne said. And that was the whole of the treaty. Winter closed over the county the way it always did, but the house at Larkspur no longer held its breath quite the way it had. Julian came now with notice, and often with nothing more urgent than an hour to spend teaching Henry a hand of cards their father had once taught him, or sitting silent by the fire while Susan read aloud, badly and proudly, from a primer. He learned, slowly, the correct spelling of names he had once signed off on, in a solicitor's letter without troubling to check, Susanna, not Susan, on formal papers, though she was Susan to everyone who loved her, and he learned too, which of the 3 hated to be teased and which lived for it. He slipped only once. In February, without asking, he arranged for a tutor from the county town to begin with Henry the following week, a decision he had made alone, out of the old habit of a man used to deciding things for a household from a distance. "You said in writing, with time to answer," Anne said, when the tutor's letter arrived unannounced at her own door. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. This was neither. Julian was silent a moment, the particular silence of a man catching himself mid-fall back into an old shape. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry. It will not happen again." "See that it doesn't," Anne said. And it did not. The school opened at Fenwick that same spring, funded by Ashford, built at Anne's insistence on the principle that a corn factor's daughter and a blacksmith's son ought to sit the same benches as any duke's grandchild, and Reverend Coulter presided over its first morning with the particular pride of a man who had spent 40 years keeping one register faithfully and lived to see it matter. Nathaniel Ross came to Larkspur often that spring, ostensibly on a state business that grew by May, transparently thin as a pretext. He brought Henry a book on the law of inheritance, which the boy read with a seriousness that made Anne laugh aloud, a sound she had nearly forgotten the shape of, and he sat with Anne over the ledgers on evenings, when there was no longer any legal reason for him to. Reviewing columns that balanced perfectly well without him, because, he admitted finally, on an evening in June with the windows open to the smell of cut hay, he had run out of honest excuses to keep coming, and had decided he would rather tell her the truth than manufacture a fourth quarter's accounts that did not need reviewing. "I have watched you build a fortress out of arithmetic and courage for 8 months," he said, "and I find I do not want to watch it from the other side of a solicitor's desk any longer. I would choose this. I have been choosing it, if I am honest, since the first hour I read your ledgers and understood what they cost you to keep so well. I mean to go on choosing it, if you will let me." "That is not the usual way men say such things," Anne said. "I am not certain you would have believed the usual way," Ross said, and she found, to her own surprise, that he was entirely right. The wedding, the following spring, was small. Fenwick Church again, Coulter's register open once more on the same table, Isaiah Dobbs and Mrs. Pruitt standing witness a second time in their lives, and Julian Merritt, Duke of Ashford, giving the bride away, because there was no one else left who had the right and every reason to want it. Henry, 9 now, stood at the front with the particular gravity of a boy who has appointed himself the man of a house, and takes the office seriously. Before the ceremony, Julian took him aside, and in front of no one but Anne, drew from his coat the signet ring their mother had given Edmund 6 years before. The one Anne had worn on a ribbon at her throat every day since. Through a fortnight's fear and a hearing that had turned a room and a winter of small accumulating proofs that a family could be rebuilt out of honesty the way a roof is. Rebuilt out of good timber, one true beam at a time. "This will be yours in its season," Julian told Henry, "as everything else will. But your mother wears it until she chooses to set it down, and I'd ask you to remember, whatever anyone tells you in years to come about who is fit to raise a duke's heir, that she is the reason there is an heir worth raising at all." He looked then at Anne, and said in front of the boy the sentence he had been circling for a year without quite landing on it. "A mother's love is not a qualification. I told you once, at your own gate. I was wrong in every particular. It is the only qualification that has ever mattered. I am sorry it took me a fortnight, and a forged register, and a room full of my own tenants to learn it." "You learned it," Anne said. "That is the only part I required." She did not set the ring down that day, nor for 2 years after, though its meaning had long since changed, no longer proof carried against a claim that might be challenged, but simply the last thing her first husband had given her, worn now beside a second marriage entered freely, on her own terms, by a woman no one would ever again mistake for merely useful. When she did set it aside at last, it was to place it in Henry's own hand on his 14th birthday, in the Ashford Library, before Julian and Ross and the 2 younger children, and to tell him precisely what it had cost, and precisely what it had proven, so that he would carry it forward knowing both. Larkspur Cottage stood still. That summer, its roof holding, its garden full, its ledgers balanced by a hand that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Ashford Hall, 11 miles off, had learned to leave its doors open on fine evenings, the particular exhale of a house that has finally stopped listening for bad news. The county went on talking, as counties do, but it had long since stopped speaking of Anne Merritt as a woman who had been made to feel invisible, and had taken instead, without quite noticing the change, to speaking of her as a woman who could not be overlooked twice. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself impossible to unsee. Not because a duke had finally chosen to look, and not because a solicitor had finally found his courage, and not because a room full of witnesses had finally turned in her favour, though all of that had happened, and mattered, and was owed its due weight, but because, on a cold October morning at her own gate, 3 children had refused to let go of her, and she had understood, in that single unbearable moment, that she did not need any court, any register, any duke's fortnight, to tell her what she had already built. The proof came after, the truth came first, and that, in the end, was not a thing that could be taken from her, by paper or by title, ever again.